The last time you were on, Jim, you took a lot of heat for a comment that you made that we had reached peak inflation. This was back in December. So it's clear now that the inflation train is still rolling forward here. Have you changed your stance since?
Yes, it's like I say, you're entitled to your own opinions, but you're not entitled to your own facts. And the facts are that inflation has played out longer than I expected in exactly the way you described. One point that I would make is that when you say this is the highest inflation since 1982, 40 years basically, that's true. But the inflation in 1982 that we're comparing it to was the end of the inflation. It started really in a severe form around 1976. And so by 1982, it had come down to 7.5% or thereabouts. So you're right about those numbers, but it was up to 15% in 1980. So 7.9 or whatever the last number was, in terms of the monthly inflation figures, yeah, that's pretty bad. But don't think it can't go a lot higher. It can. What I expected, and I still expect this. Let me put it this way: I still expect this, but I pushed out the time horizon because a lot has happened and we have more data. There are two kinds of inflation. And one is what they call cost push inflation. The other one is demand pull inflation. Those are economic jargon. But demand pull is when it's driven by the consumers, the everyday American or everyday person around the world. They see some inflation. They go ask the boss for a raise. They go, hey, I need more money to keep up. They accelerate gee, if that refrigerator is going to be more expensive 3 months from now, maybe I better buy it today before the price goes up. It kind of feeds on itself, but it's very much driven by consumer behavior, the behavior of labor and working people, trying to keep ahead of something that they're living through. So that's demand pull. The other kind of inflation is called cost push. That comes from the supply side. That basically is, an oil embargo or a war in Ukraine or economic sanctions or supply chain disruption. There could be a lot of causes or multiple causes, but basically it's not that the consumer has so much changed his or her perspective, but they can't get stuff, or the suppliers are raising the prices because, hey, our input prices are higher, so we have to raise the prices to consumers. Now you can have both. One can feed. It can start as sort of cost push, meaning it starts with supply chain disruption, comes from the supply side, but then the consumers say, hey, no mas, enough. I want to raise, and so it can feed on itself. The reason I make that distinction is because the Fed can possibly do something about the demand side. The Fed can, squash it by raising interest rates and raising mortgage rates and deflating asset values, et cetera. The Fed can't do anything about oil. The Fed can't do anything about the supply side. They maybe people think they can, but they can't. And that was what we saw. That was how it started in the 1970s. It started with the Arab oil embargo, which went through two separate phases, one with the Arab-Israeli war, and then later with Iran. We had two separate, periods of spiking gas prices and gas lines in 1974, again in 1979. But that started from a supply side that the Fed couldn't do anything about, although the Fed probably was too easy at the start of it. So right now, this inflation has come from the supply side. Now, how will it play out on the demand side? That's the question.
I had one professor of applied economics on saying, look, this inflation has nothing to do with broken supply chains, et cetera. It solely has to do with money supply and the surplus of it. So would you say not so to that?
I completely disagree with that description, and I'll tell you why. And I've said this before. The Fed has exploded the money supply. So there's no question about that. M0 has gone up by 400%. The Fed's trying to rein it in a little bit. But when you go from $800 billion in 2008 to 4.3 trillion in 2013 when they started the taper to 7 or 8 trillion, which is where it was after the pandemic in the spring of 2020, there's no question about the money printing. But that money doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't do anything. It's basically the Fed expands M0 by buying bonds from the banks. They take the bonds on the portfolio. They give the money to the banks. Money comes out of thin air, but the banks just give it back to the Fed as a deposit in the form of excess reserves. So you're inflating the liability side, which are the excess reserves, and the asset side, which are the bonds. You've inflated your balance sheet, you've increased M0, but you haven't done one thing for the economy. There's nothing about what I just described that goes into the real economy. Now, where does money for the real economy come from? It comes from commercial banks lending and consumers spending, and that shows up in velocity. And if you look at the velocity statistics, they've crashed in the last 10 years and they're still going down. So the reason so-called money printing doesn't turn into inflation is because the money doesn't go anywhere.
You're saying now, okay, it's not peak. You see it headed higher and lasting for how long? What's your current thesis here?
Okay,
and to what level?
Again, well, that's why, great question. That's why I spent time on the supply side versus the demand side, because the demand side isn't really there yet. Velocity is not going up. People are noticing. I mean, they notice, and it has a huge political impact, but it's coming from the supply side. And I have spent a lot of time studying the supply chain, so I could see that. But then the war in Ukraine and the sanctions were like putting a turbocharger on it. Okay, it's worse, and it's going to get worse.
Before we continue, help us clicking that YouTube like button and subscribe now to our channel. This shows the algorithm that you valued this information. And it helps us spread that message. Sharing is caring. And now, let's continue.
I have bad news for you. If you're not rich by now, you're screwed. And if you're in debt, you're even double screwed. How so, you might wonder? Well, the sad truth is that you're working your whole life to make someone else rich. The mega corporations, the banks, the politicians, everyone is getting richer. They get your money. And what is even worse, they get your time, they get your life. You are not even in a rat race. You're in a financial prison. But what could a solution for you look like? Honestly, I don't know, but I know what a solution for me would look like. It's very simple. I use whatever money I have and I multiply it with 1,000. This could make my life much easier and probably yours as well. If you have $1,000 available and multiply this with 1,000, I believe that this could solve some financial issue for the one or the other. Of course, if you're ugly, you would have to multiply it with much more than 1,000. My name is Markus Dahn, and this is what I decided to do. I decided to 1000x my money. This is not a joke. I know what you may be thinking. What is this guy talking about? How should this work? This is not possible. Well, I made a detailed video where I laid out my plan. And some clever folks might even want to look at this plan and copy it and do exactly what I do. This is just a little hint on the side. You have two options. You leave, you forget what you have seen. You do whatever you're doing and you hope that somehow you get some other results. Good luck with that. Or you click the link below the video. You enter your email address because I'm not showing this to everybody. You at least watch my video on how I plan to 1000x my money. The choice is yours. Make the right choice. Join me. See what a different future you could have. See at least how I plan to do the 1000x. So click on the link below, enter your email address, and I see you on the other side. Your Markus Dahn.